The burden of living two lives is that your truck is always full of your uniforms, and I think I've changed more times in parking lots than I have at home. And to that, my wife often jokes that when she comes into the closet, she says, "All this is yours." So we, in fact, had to buy a rolling closet just to put all my uniforms in because I have so many of them. And God love her, without her and my family's support, I wouldn't have been able to keep all these plates in the air. So duality of service is what I'll speak on tonight. And I'll lead into that with a little explanation of how policing is tied into international service. So it's funny, we simulate Remembrance Day strictly with soldiers. So what we don't realize is back in 1956, during the Suez Crisis, and Canada really got its teeth into peacekeeping, we actually started to deploy police officers. So we've had 4,000 police officers under the UN banner in 66 missions since we started sending police officers overseas. That's a lot of police officers. They typically go for a year, and under the Canadian police arrangement, the federal government supplies the RCMP with funding which pays salaries and training to enable the RCMP to be the gatekeepers for sending police officers overseas. Any given year, you may see in upwards of 150, 160 to as low as 20 go, depending on the tempo of operations that the Government of Canada is having overseas. So from that, the RCMP in Ottawa controls the flow of police officers out to all these different countries. And you would think they might mostly be RCMP officers. But what you don't realize is that 70% are municipal and provincial partners, which includes members of the HRP, Halifax Regional Police, that have deployed overseas. We've had 30% RCMP members. So in all those provinces and municipalities and townships, we've actually used police officers to attach to Canadian Armed Forces units and deploy overseas. This is where my story begins, is in 2007, I was attached to the RCR Battle Group in Kandahar City as a part of the provincial reconstruction team, and met a few people in the room tonight, actually for the first time, in different roles, but I was a Mountie, and I know Rhonda's in the back there, and she was a Canadian Armed Forces officer. So we were essentially, there were 6 of us, and in 2007 we were thrown into the PRT, we were attached to a Canadian Armed Forces Battle Group, and we deployed. So everywhere they went, we went. So this is sort of a personal story as to what you would expect, what you wouldn't expect a police officer to do in the sandy fields of Afghanistan. So what was my job? I was told it was senior police advisor to the Afghan National Police. Now, when you think of a police officer, you think maybe getting a ticket, maybe solving a break and enter. Let me tell you what it's like in Afghanistan. 80% illiteracy. The average police officer will probably have a t-shirt, his pants held up by a rope and flip-flops, and have an AK-47 with, if he's lucky, 2 to 3 bullets in it, and maybe of those bullets, 2 are rusted together so the weapon won't even fire. That was what we had to deal with when we arrived on the ground, and we were part of the first 6. So the first 6 of us were all either ex-military or we came from tactical backgrounds. We were mandated to deliver rule of law, which is basically teach them the ins and outs of the judicial system as it related to Canada and spread the good word in Afghanistan. What we quickly found out was we were reduced to teaching them survival skills. And I mean very basic survival skills. First aid, putting a hand on a bleeding wound, as simple as that. We taught them, we had intended to talk about diversity and gender in policing. We didn't get there. The full year of my mission was spent on more or less teaching combat, basic police skills, patrolling, how to identify IEDs, and we did so with, first we did it with the RCR Battle Group, then they left, and then the Van Doos came in, and then finally at the end of that, the US Army came in. So my group had the privilege of seeing how different groups did business with the Afghans, and I have to tell you, the Canadians had it right. They loved us, we had the right approach, and there's a reason why Canada keeps getting called to these places of conflict is because we have a Canadian way. We have a way of doing business that no one else can replicate. So that's a typical mission analysis for me. That's my mandate now that I'm in country. Very dangerous, not what we expected. Some of my comrades went home. They didn't sign up for that. They weren't ready for it. Some of them didn't leave the camp. But we did what we had to do. So I'll give you a small story of a typical day that I encountered out in Panjwai district, which is, for those familiar with Afghanistan, is the heart of the Taliban at the time in 2007. I was teaching a class, so I would have to get out there with them, with the military. They would provide a security perimeter, and we would teach a class. So picture, if you will, my students sitting cross-legged with their AK-47s against the door, eating bread, some paying attention, some not, with an interpreter trying to explain how you effect an arrest or whatever we were teaching for the day. Sound of gunfire, Taliban's attacking the camp. Everybody jumps up, they grab their rifles, they run out the door, they run out past the Canadian soldiers, they get into a firefight, there's casualties, they come back, they celebrate, they eat bread, some smoke the joint, they sit back down, and class resumes. That actually happened. So the takeaway here is, when you see the Blue Berets on Remembrance Day, and you see those in the crowd, sometimes they're not all soldiers. Canada projects a whole-of-government approach wherever it goes, because Canada does what Canada does best. We send diplomats, we send Correction Services Canada, we send public safety, we send CSIS. They've all done their part over there in places like Afghanistan. So I ask you to keep that in mind, that not every person who serves their country is a soldier, which leads me to my last point. First responders. And Joanna talked about it when she opened her song. She said, thank you for all those in service, and thank you to first responders. And that's very important. So first responders and soldiers. So take today, for example. I did the parade. I had the honor of leading the parade for the PLF down at the Boer War Memorial. As I'm walking back, a couple of people said, thank you for your service. I think what you do is great. When you're in uniform, you get that. Sometimes we forget that first responders are also on the front line. And if I may, and because I wear two hats, I'm going to share with you a very unique perspective. A regular force soldier will get the green light to go overseas. They'll spend a couple months working up. Their family will be aware of where they're going. Preparations are made. The wills are looked after. Everyone anticipates the danger that they may or may not face. They deploy as a unit. They go over together. They face whatever hardship or trauma that they may face. Back in Canada, their families are looked after, typically by the unit or the Family Resource Center. They come home, and then they're debriefed. They're allowed a decompression. And then they typically go into a tempo of reduced operations until the next call. So, if I may now, take you into the world of a first responder who gets up at odd hours, leaves his or her home alone in the car, faces untold trauma and bad things, whether it be EHS, a firefighter, a police officer. They deal with it. They come home alone. They may or may not speak to their family about it. And they get up the next day and they do the very same thing again. And they do that, some I know, for 20, 30 years. So I see no difference in the amount of service given in a 6-month tour than somebody who punches those hours in every day for you, for Canadians. It's the same thing. Have we come a long way? I have to give credit. Department of National Defense has done a fantastic job in the last 10 years. From lessons learned from Afghanistan, we're recognizing now that operational stress injuries and post-traumatic stress disorder are things we have to watch for, and we have to look after each other. The first responder world is slowly catching up. But the one thing that you can do is, if you thank a soldier for their service, please thank a first responder. And when you're at Tim's and you say, Oh, look, there's the Mount. He's pulling in for another donut. It could be that's the only thing that he or she has had to eat the whole shift. Put it in perspective, and if you see them at the counter, say, thank you for your service. It means a lot to me as a soldier and as a first responder. Thank you so much.